Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event with 192 Books. I'm Evan, the manager here at 192, and I am really thrilled tonight to be welcoming Rosanna Warren and Christopher Benfey to talk about Rosanna's new book, Max Jacob, A Life, sorry, A Life in Art and Letters. And this is normally the time when I'd be holding up this beautiful new book, but we actually sold out of it today. That's how excited people are, and people want to hear about Max Jacob, and we're going to give it to them tonight. Don't already know, Rosanna is a poet, critic, biographer. Previous books include Fables of the Self, So Forth, Ghost in a Red Hat. And Christopher is the author of Summer of Hummingbirds, as well as If, a book on Rudyard Kipling's time in America. Tonight they're going to be talking about this new book and sort of Max Jacob's life and legacy. Rosanna's going to be reading some of his poems, and at the end of the night, they'll be taking questions from you, the audience. So if you have a question now, if you have a question at any time during the discussion, you can email it to evan@192books.com. There is a link right below where you can send those questions over. And yeah, the earlier you send a question, the better chance you'll have an answer tonight. So send them in early and often. And with all that being said, I am going to hand it over to Rosanna and Christopher. Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you so much, Evan. Am I audible? Am I audible? I hope so. Good. Thank you to 192 Books. Thank you to the Paula Cooper Gallery. Thank you, Christopher, for playing with me, and Max. I thought I would start by reading a poem in my English translation to give you a sense of Jacob, the lyrical poet, because he's best known in France and outside of France as the renovator of the prose poem. But I want you to hear his lyrics too. This is from 1927. It's a poem called Agonies and More, and it brings up the theme of his tragically divided loves. He was a Jew who converted to Roman Catholicism as a result of a mystical revelation. And yet he was a very passionate homosexual with many, many male lovers, and thought he probably would go to hell for those loves. So he lived in shame and guilt, but also passion. And that's what this poem is about. Agonies and More. I'm afraid you'll take offense as I weigh and weigh again in my works and in my heart, your love from which I live apart, that other love I'm dying in. What will these lines be about? God, whom you nag day in, day out? God, his angels and his priests? Or your love's infernal feasts and their gobbling agonies? Righteous rocks, old blood-soaked gods, I leave, return, veer close again to my all too easy sin. My loves are in my pocket here. I'll sail weeping out to sea. On Edinburgh city wall, so much sorrow marries so much love. This evening, poetry, your horse wears a black veil.
Yikes, what a great note to start on. My lives are in my pocket here. Great to be here. Great to be with you, Rosanna, many miles away, but seemingly next door. I greet you from Emily Dickinson's Amherst. Sometimes biographers feel obscurely that their subjects choose them. And I was wondering if you might start out with some of the ways in which Max Jacob found you. I think in the introduction to the book, you talk a little bit about that sense of being tracked by Jacob or pursued by him, partly.
Yes, indeed. It was almost a mystical experience. Yeah, almost a mystical experience for me. I was 20 years old. I was training to be a painter. I wanted to be a painter. I was in Paris that summer in a painting program, but in the afternoons I was working in the great library, the Jacques Doucet library, on the manuscripts of studio notebooks of the painter André Derain for somebody else who needed them. And in the Derain notebooks and boxes, I found letters from Jacob, because it turned out that Derain had illustrated one of Jacob's early books for the great Cubist dealer, Daniel Henri Kahnweiler. Picasso's dealer. Anyway, I stumbled that way as a child, I would say, on this mystical Jewish Catholic poet, painter, man of contradictions. He was always poor, but he was friends with very wealthy people like Coco Chanel and princes and princesses. He was ascetic, but also worldly. He was very devoutly religious, but also a passionately sexual person. And I just became obsessed with him. And I went down to the Benedictine monastery in the Loire Valley, Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, where he spent in all 14 years as a lay associate of this sort of semi-disbanded monastery. So I went to, I thought, draw the Romanesque capitals of this great basilica from the 11th century. But in the little bookshop there were books of Max Jacob's, and I began reading his poems. And I felt it was a case of possession. In my sketchbooks, I began writing poems to him in his voice. It's not that I'd never written before. I'd been writing since I was a small child, but my writing was private. My writing was almost secret. I wanted to be a painter. I felt kidnapped. I felt as if a ghostly hand had taken over my hand. And instead of drawing the capitals, I was writing these poems. And when I got back to the United States that fall, back to college, I was still a school girl, you might say. I showed them to my dean, who was also the editor of the Yale Review, and he said, "Hey, these are really good." And before I knew it, they were published, and then other poems began to come out in other journals. And it was almost painful to me, as over the next few years, I was drawn away from being a painter into the life of being a writer, a life I had actively decided not to pursue. So Jacob really kidnapped me. He threw me off track, and I've never recovered.
He didn't just find you. He took hold, he possessed you. I love that. Yes. And so you went from this sort of spirit possession to becoming a fabulous, uncanny translator of Jacob. And I'm curious about the relationship between translation and biography in this case. Did you feel that translating these poems gave you some kind of special access to Jacob as a biographical subject? I also wonder, I mean, you've talked about how your own poetry was taken over by this voice, how your own poetry has developed during your long dance with Max Jacob.
I certainly didn't imagine I would write a biography when I was 20 years old and those poems started invading my sketchbook.
You said you were a little skeptical of biography at that point in your
indeed,
life.
I will not forget this, because when my first book of poems came out a few years later, my wonderful editor, Kathleen Anderson, who then became an agent, and she called me up and said, "People love these poems to Max Jacob. Why don't you write a biography?" And I was such a little snot, such an appalling little ignorant snot at age 27 or 28. I remember saying, "I would never write a biography. It's a low mimetic mode." That's me, my modernist infantile self, a low mimetic mode. I won't do that. I have to get data, have to organize facts. And then I hung up, and 5 minutes later, I thought, how can I not write his life? He has already changed my life. So I called Kathy back, and that started this long odyssey. It's embarrassing. I'm ashamed to say it took me 35 years to write this book, because the research turned out to be so complicated. But I'm not sorry that it took so long, because it meant that when I started the biographical quest in 1985, I could interview a lot of people who had known Jacob. And of course, they're all dead now. And also, a lot of scholarship has happened in the meantime. A lot of people have begun working, scholars have begun working on Jacob. So I was able to benefit from a lot of people's work, people who weren't working and publishing in 1985. Anyway, this is a long answer to your question. But the question about translation is important, key, because I didn't start thinking I was going to write a biography, but I started translating his poems out of love for them. I wanted to see if I could make them sound in English. The poem I just read, Agonies and More, Angoisse et autres in French, is in a particularly French prosody called vers impair. It's 7 syllables, uneven, and you don't count syllables in English, so you can't do exactly that. But I wanted to get, let's say, I wanted to recreate the feeling of those cadences and those rhymes and that slight dissonance, that slightly off kilter feeling. And so that was, entering the poems was way preceded any idea of biography.
I remember Verlaine, I think, in his La Poétique says we should prefer the l'impair,
exactly. Yes.
Yeah, interesting. The odd numbered line with a sort of odd kick to it. Yeah, that's beautiful. There's a big, I don't know, it's not exactly an elephant in the room. Is Picasso an elephant? But there's a remarkable lifelong friendship at the heart of this book. Just an amazing friendship between Picasso and Max Jacob. They were each the most important person in the other's life for a significant period of time. And I'm wondering if tonight you could situate the two of them a little bit in the history of modernism. Part of the force of your marvelous book is that it gives a kind of insider's view of the creation of modernism in relationships like the one between Picasso and Jacob. I'm thinking of Cubism. I'm thinking of course, but also of Jacob's experiments with prose poems, with experimental, really wild experimental fiction in your account of it, mystical, extraordinarily fantastical, and maybe along the way we could hear one of the lyrics and maybe one of those just remarkable prose poems. I mean, this is one of the inventors of the prose poem for the 20th century.
Yeah, thank you. Jacob was Picasso's first French friend. Picasso first came to Paris at 18, just turning 19 in 1901, and had a show at Vollard, which was an incredible coup for an unknown young Spaniard. And Vollard was the great dealer of the Impressionists and Cézanne. Jacob, who was living in tremendous poverty in Paris and was 10 years older than Picasso, had been a professional art critic for about a year, but he'd left that and he was doing odd jobs, all kinds of ridiculous odd jobs, like being as he called it, a nanny for rich kids and working as a clerk and so forth. Anyway, he dropped by Vollard, which he did often because he loved painting and did some painting himself. And he saw these amazing paintings by a complete unknown. And he left a note with Vollard saying, "Who is this Pablo Picasso? I would like to meet him." And the next thing we knew that there was a note from Picasso's dealer, and they met. And even though Picasso could hardly speak French then, and Jacob didn't know any Spanish, they somehow communicated and recognized each other as artists, and they saw each other every day those first several months that Picasso spent in Paris, and they became blood brothers in a way of art. They recognized each other. This was way before Cubism, 1901. Picasso was imitating Toulouse-Lautrec and a little bit El Greco, but anyway. So when Picasso came back in 1903 to try to take hold of Paris, he was intensely poor and he couldn't sell anything because it was the blue, beginning to be the blue period, and no dealer wanted to buy emaciated prostitutes and desperately male alcoholics. And so he had nothing to eat, and he was living in an attic and starving to death. And Jacob visited him and was so horrified. Jacob was terribly poor himself, but at least he had his little wages from his little odd job. So he invited Picasso to come stay with him, and they shared a room for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. It's not quite clear, but certainly a month or two. And Jacob supported them. and they had the same bed. They were not. It was not a sexual relationship. Picasso is very, very heterosexual, and Jacob very, very gay. But it was an intense brotherly love, and so the sharing the bed was that Picasso slept during the day while Jacob was out working, and Picasso painted at night while Jacob was sleeping in the bed. Picasso never forgot that Jacob saved him. He never forgot that. And when he came back to Paris the next year in 1904 with more armed to survive and got the studio up in the Bateau Lavoir in Montmartre and began the radical revolution that we know, Jacob was in the studio every day, watching every brushstroke, every drawing. And they shared this sense of creating a new world. So what did that mean for modernism? For Picasso, it meant breaking Renaissance perspective. So you no longer had single point perspective, meant multiplying perspectives. It meant shattering the discrete form, say, of a human being or a jug, shattering it, fracturing it, and reconstituting the fragments. It meant a whole new idea about composition. And for Jacob, it meant shattering traditional French verse. It meant taking the traditional Alexandrine 12-syllable line of Racine and Corneille and breaking it, but putting it back together in some odd way. It meant breaking narrative logic. It meant breaking discursive logic. It meant discontinuity, an art of discontinuity, but really strategic, not chaotic at all. And out of this fracturing would come some sort of visionary experience. And for Jacob, this visionary experience really was mystical. It was spiritual. He, at that period, he would see angels and demons and talk with them. And if I can read that just from slightly later when he was beginning to invent the prose poems even then, but there's a quotation that I think gives you a sense of what he was after. And this was a little prose poem. Mystery is in this life, reality in the other. If you love me, I'll show you reality. So I think that I'll show you reality is really what Picasso was trying to do with the Cubist paintings, and by breaking things up, but revealing some essential form. And it's what Jacob was trying to do by breaking up narrative, breaking up traditional cadences, breaking up any explanation. It was all non sequitur. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's so open and vulnerable. And, if we think of other prose poem masters in French like Baudelaire and Rimbaud, there's a really different, much more muscled sort of music to it. And Jacob just seems so available, so remarkable. I mean, I imagine that was part of Picasso's love for him, that this was someone who gave himself completely.
I think so. And Picasso learned French fast and recognized that Jacob was a great inventor. So when Apollinaire joined the group, which he did in 1905, the nucleus, which was Jacob and Picasso, Apollinaire then became friends with them both, intense. So for a while they were kind of trio of revolutionary artists making a new world, which we know is modernism. At that time, Apollinaire was much more of a crooner. He was a symbolist poet. He was doing luscious, lovely lyrics, but full of imagery of magicians and fairies and witches. And Jacob said, cut it out. He said, look at the Eiffel Tower. There's a bus going by. What about the advertisement? There's trash in the street. Never mind the magicians and the fairies. And also shake up your Alexandrins.
Good advice.
And Apollinaire did. And then we have Alcool, and he became a great modernist poet and inventor in his own right. But I can read you, if you like, one of these famous prose poems that Jacob transformed the French prose poem. In Baudelaire and Mallarmé, it had been a kind of little vignette, allegory, beautiful, more parable, but comprehensible. You could follow an argument and a narrative and a scene. And with Rimbaud, the prose poem in Illumination becomes much more subjective and dreamlike, but very emotional. And what Jacob does in the 20th century, his kind of modernism was cool. It was cool, it was hard-edged, it was critical, meta-critical. He has some of them saying, to you, or basically sort of up yours, Baudelaire, up yours. I mean, it was, you had to know French poetry to understand what was being criticized. And so as Picasso's paintings were becoming more and more abstract, yet at the same time figurative, Jacob's prose poems are abstract. And this prose poem, called simply Poem, from the famous book, The Dice Cup, 1917, is about abstraction. It's about film as the art of representation, but not of subject matter, only of what he calls the rhythm. It's hailing on the sea. Night is falling. Light the bull lighthouse beam. The old courtesan has died at the inn. Everyone's laughing in the house. It's hailing, and they're showing a film to the sailors in the schoolroom. The teacher has a fine face. Here I am in the country. 2 men are watching the bull beam shining. Here you are finally, the teacher says to me. Are you going to take notes during the film? The little bunch of assistant teachers can make room for you on the table. Notes? What notes should I take? On the subjects of the film? No, you'll compress the rhythms of the film and the falling hail, and also the laughter of everyone present at the death of the old courtesan to get an idea of purgatory.
It's kind of an art poétique, isn't it?
It is very much an art poétique. Yes, right.
Wonderful. Maybe one of his lyrics as well. Is there one that maybe we could hear it in French and in English? Would that be
let's do that.
Fun? Yeah.
Yes, that would be fun. Here's one that's quite explicitly about his gay experience. And the more you know Jacob, the more you see that his queer poetics are woven through almost everything he does. A lot of gender bending, a lot of games between male and female, a lot of jokes. So here is the Infernal Vision in the form of a madrigal. I'll read it first in English and then in French. Handsome knights of Alcantara, Venus of Marne la Coquette, the Nabob of Calatrava offers you his private yacht to sail away to Guatemala. When I had renounced your love, O women, when I had of pleasure intoned the requiem and conquered Bethlehem, when I had cast off the henbane of this world and of the wandering Jew's eternal voyage the sail unfurled, when beneath the cramped balcony the vice squad and its laughter ringing de profundis, knocking as in the old days at my door to enroll me in its militias, I had made my room a secret oasis or almshouse. I did not yet know the clear sky of your eyes, the snowy kingdom of your limbs in summer, nor the perfumed hell in your thick hair, nor your beauty, which will be my holy grail, nor your soul, for which I shall be Parsifal. Handsome knights of Alcantara, handsome knights of Alcantara, all aboard, anchors away. Let them rush off toward the tropics. I have only one mystic exodus, one reliquary and its relic. I have one tender oasis only, you, your eyes, their forget-me-not blue. And in French, Vision infernale en forme de madrigal. Beau chevalier d'Alcantara, Vénus de Marne la coquette, le nabab de Calatrava vous fait offrir sa goélette pour partir au Guatemala. Quand j'avais renoncé à votre amour, ô femmes, quand j'avais du plaisir, chanté le requiem et conquis Bethléem, quand du monde j'avais repoussé la jusquiame, du voyage éternel d'Isaac l'Achédème, quand j'avais pris la rame, quand sous les 3 balcons la patrouille dévisse, et ses rires sonnant comme un dé profondis, frappant comme jadis ma porte afin de me pousser dans ses milices, j'avais fait de ma chambre une secrète oasis, ou plutôt un hospice. Je n'avais pas connu le ciel clair de tes yeux, le neigeux univers de ton corps estival, ni l'enfer embaumé de tes épais cheveux, ni ta beauté qui me sera le saint Graal, ni ton âme dont je serai le Parsifal. Beau chevalier d'Alcantara, beau chevalier d'Alcantara, le bateau part, on n'attend pas. Qui s'en aille vers les tropiques? Je n'ai qu'une exode mystique, qu'un reliquaire et sa relique. Je n'ai plus qu'une tendre oasis, ce sont tes yeux de Myosotis.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you read both of them because we can hear so clearly the song-like quality that you've gotten that matches his so wonderfully. I mean, this sort of playful madrigal music of the thing, really just gorgeous. I did leave one little thread hanging, and that is, do you have any quick thoughts on how your own poetry has it's impossible, like, tell us about your own poetry, Rosanna. But have you felt maybe some of this, some of the distinctive music of Jacob's poetry invading your own? You've talked about the other kind of possession, but
yes.
Or are these two different worlds for you?
They can't be two different worlds. I have many other, I'd say, familiar spirits, Horace, Catullus, Villon, Thomas Hardy, so it's complicated, but DNA is always complicated. But Jacob is very important, and I would say also Apollinaire and Reverdy, 20th century and 19th century French. I just adored this poetry. I know a lot of it by heart. As a child in the lycée in France, we memorized hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines of poetry as part of the lycée training, which I think is great. Anyway, it's part of my consciousness. So of course it comes into my writing my own poems, not directly. No one, I think, reading my poems would say, oh, that sounds like Max Jacob. I mean, I think reading Frank O'Hara, you might more say that sounds like Max Jacob. But the
perfect analogy. Yeah, perfect.
But the freedom that he had to flip switches, to change levels of diction abruptly, to change the subject fast, to mix the high with the vulgar, to have an enormous emotional range as well as a lexical range, and maybe most important, I think for him, the phonetic, the sound pattern is more important than the semantic, than the meaning, or he presses the sound pattern so that the meaning sense, the semantic sense, sort of emerges as a mystical revelation. When he says, I will show you reality, I think it's partly out of abracadabra, out of a magic spell. And I learned from that. I think fundamentally, I think poetry is abracadabra.
Yes.
I think it should be
magic charms.
Yeah, it should be. And that really matters. The phonemes matter, the sound matters.
Yeah, exactly. Rev up our Ouija boards. Yeah, I know.
Yes.
You've already evoked some of these settings, the very rich landscapes and locales that you explored in the book, the shabby Montmartre apartments, the Catholic retreat where Jacob spent so much time tragically at the end of his life. Brittany, an incredible world that you summon of family origins for Jacob, a very different France from Paris. But perhaps none of these locales is so strange and eerie and tragic as the concentration camp at Drancy, which is Jacob's sort of final stop on the line. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about these settings and perhaps wend our way to Drancy, which has a kind of terrifying fascination.
Yes, thank you. I'm thanking you for the question because I think place is really important. And in my long odyssey of pursuing his story, I went to all these places. I had spent part of my childhood in Brittany, and I think that a very young childhood, I was even in a village school there for a while. So I think maybe it was his Bretonness that part of what appealed to me in the very beginning. Anyway, so I went back to Brittany. I went to Quimper various times, walked around the streets. I haunted it, and I haunted the places in Paris where he lived, and I haunted Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, where the Benedictine monastery town, and I wanted
all
to
those.
feel.
All of those places are so evocative in your book. It's, if you had said you hadn't visited them, I would have thought you really were sort of summoning some spell from because there really is a tactile feel for those locales in your account of them. But sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, I'm so glad you feel that. I often wondered writing this book whether I would ever finish it. I used to say, I don't know who's going to die first, Max or me. And I think he died first finally. But anyway, I was so hoping that readers would feel that these places were real and had a spirit. But Drancy was one of the real discoveries for me. I knew about it intellectually, but I went there. It's a horrifying place. It's north of Paris. You can get there from a subway trip outside of Paris. It's northeast of Paris, not far. And it was designed as a utopian modernist experiment. Opened in 1935. It was the first high-rise towers in France. It was an habitation bon marché, low-income housing. It had 17-story towers and a huge horseshoe-shaped sort of barracks. So the horseshoe shape is important architecturally. That was about 4 stories high, and they moved some police families, and they're in there in the 1935, and the plumbing didn't work, and the elevators blocked, and the heating stopped. They sort of soon moved out, and then World War II happened, and in the drôle de guerre, in the phony war, the French government used it as a prison camp for communists. But as soon as the Germans invaded in June 1940, they said, "Oh, this is a perfect concentration camp." All you had to do was take this enormous horseshoe shape, which was as big as a football field, just put barbed wire along the open part, and you have a camp. And a lot of the buildings in that part of the camp weren't even finished. So when the Germans started, first they put French prisoners of war in there from the ignominious defeat of France in 1940. But very soon they moved those guys to Germany, and they threw in the Jews. Thousands of them that they had gathered up in these rafles, these roundups, like the famous Veille d'hiver. But before that, there were these many of these roundups. And first it was just men they threw in there who had to sleep on cement. There was no heat. There were no toilets. People were dying of dysentery and pneumonia and starvation. The Red Cross wasn't let in. Nobody knew what was going on in there. And then they started throwing in women and children. And so I went there, and guess what? Right after World War II, there was a housing shortage in France. They turned this concentration camp where 76,000 French Jews were sent from there. If they didn't die there, they were sent to Auschwitz or the other extermination camps. It was the major transport camp of Vichy to the Nazi exterminations. They turned it back into a housing development right away, where all those people died. I've been there. There are little cars parked. People are living in those barracks. Of course, they're poor people, and they don't know, most of them, what went on there. Though there is finally a Jewish French association years after the war, agitated so much that they put a monument up in the front of what I'm calling the horseshoe, which is quite often defaced with anti-Semitic paint slogans. And they also put one French National Railway car, SNCF, of the exact period of 1942, 43, when they were using the French National Railway to take people to Auschwitz. They put a car there to try to, I guess, acknowledge what happened. So I've walked around there. I know exactly which part of the barrack Jacob was in and where he died. It's eerie, and it's eerie that this modernist utopian, it was considered a great architectural feat. The designs were shown proudly in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and in the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris in 1935. And it became a concentration camp with a snap of the fingers.
I was going to say, from utopia to dystopia like that, just
right.
But also a hideous allegory somehow for the French forgetting of the collaboration, of the strange defeat, of the whole horrible, and then the reinvention of France as a country of resistance.
Right.
So it seems Trancy's weird sort of snap of the finger reinvention seems perfect for that history. You and I can't help but feel some creepy resonance in the collapse of democracy in France during this period, and our own nervous making time. I'm glad we're not having this occasion any closer to November 3rd. And this is a period when, as you've said, there's increasing vulnerability of Jews to the point of extermination camps and of homosexuals.
Yes.
And I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about analogies with our time. I'm sure. These may not be things you want to talk about, but it seems somehow for me to read the book this fall just felt so profoundly unsettling, and just so many moments of recognition.
Yeah. I have felt this way for at least 10 years as I worked on the book, a bifocal feeling that I was reading about the failure of democracy in France, which didn't fail suddenly. It didn't fail in June 1940 when the Nazis invaded and Pétain dissolved the Third Republic and became the head of an authoritarian state. It started failing decades before as people lost faith in their institutions. The French were losing faith in voting. Ever hear of that? They lost faith in their judges, in their judicial system, in their legal system. They lost faith in the press. And there was a powerful far right, at times monarchist, certainly nationalist movements, Action Française being one of the strongest. It goes way, way back into the 20s. And with Charles Morin, Léon Daudet. Léon Daudet, by the way, Jacob knew.
And yeah.
And I want to read because I think, even though I partly grew up in France and have Jewish French friends and a long sense of what Jewish life in France has been, many things it's been, I still find shocking what was considered normal to discourse about Jews. So I would like to shock some others, or maybe you won't be shocked, but one of Hitler's favorite books was a French book by Édouard Drumont, published in 1886. It was called La France Juive, Jewish France. And it was a bestseller in the 19th century France. There were only two books that were the national bestsellers of the century, and one was this one, and the other one was Renan's Life of Jesus. So here's Drumont, who was hugely popular and whose work was cited in the 20th century. The Jew grips his prey and will not release it. One Christian child a year fulfills this bloody sacrifice. Every century, it is the martyrdom of an entire Christian nation, which the Jews require. Well, that's 1886, but just in the 20th century, that kind of rhetoric you hear in Action Française. You hear it published in the Nouvelle Revue Française, which was the most distinguished journal in France. So just as an example, Jacob had been extremely close to a writer called Marcel Jouandeau, who was published by the Nouvelle Revue Française, Gallimard, the most eminent publishing house. He was considered one of France's major writers, fiction writers. And Jacob and Jouandeau were very close friends for about 10 years, really close, wonderful letters back and forth. And then Jouandeau got increasingly anti-Semitic, and Jacob was utterly shocked when in 1936, Jouandeau published in the, he published this in Action Française, but he published other things like this in the Nouvelle Revue Française. He said the essay is how I became an anti-Semite. And I just want to, and he named his friend, Jacob was in there along with other disgusting Jews, like Léon Blum, who was the Jewish prime minister, socialist, who had sort of horrified the right, Julien Benda and Maurice Sachs, but never mind. So Jacob features in this review. He's unnamed, but it's clearly Jacob as this terrible parasite on France, pretending to be a Catholic. And this is what Jouandeau writes in 1936 about Jews. I vow to point them out to the vengeance of my people as long as a single one remains in France who has not been subjected to a special legal status. Well, that was 1936. 4 years later, Vichy did exactly that. And your question about the United States today is, I'm not saying it's the same thing as Vichy France, but we're looking more like that, with the persecution of minorities, with an authoritarian state rather than a functioning democracy, with the undermining of faith in the courts, the undermining of faith in journalism, of any kind of factual reporting and testing of fact. All of this is going on right now. And when it was going on in France, a lot of people didn't believe it or see it. That's what scares me.
And a lot
I
of
recognize the signs.
A lot of the same fantasies about Jews you just mentioned reappearing in QAnon. So we promised the audience access to you. Before we do so, though, we have 2 or 3 minutes, and I thought maybe we would close our own conversation, Rosanna, with maybe a quick circling back to Picasso, who did not turn against Jacob at the end, though questions have been raised about Picasso's difficult role at this time when Jacob was in the hands of the Gestapo. And then maybe we could end this segment with another of Jacob's prose poems, that my favorite of these prose poems.
Good.
The little toad.
Yes.
So maybe briefly, Picasso at the end with Jacob, and then maybe Le Crapaud to finish.
Good. Picasso, when Jacob left Paris in 1921 to go to the monastery the first time, he was leaving behind the urban world. He was leaving behind the art world of Paris. He was leaving behind a lot, and Picasso commemorated this departure with 2 great paintings, both called The Three Musicians. One is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and one's at the Philadelphia. One is a kind of stylized portrait of their dead friend Apollinaire. One is a stylized self-portrait of Picasso as Harlequin. And one's a stylized portrait of Jacob as a monk. And Picasso and Jacob had a lot of ups and downs in their friendship after that. But when Picasso's marriage was breaking up to Olga, he asked Jacob to come live with him. And that was years later. And Jacob was already in Saint-Benoît, and he said, I'm sorry, Pablo, I love you, but I can't do that. First of all, he said, you're going to have too many ladies around. I can't stand all the ladies. And they said, and you're friends with communists, so I can't do it. And Picasso drove down once when he was still with Olga, with his son and Paolo, to Quimper to visit Jacob and his family overnight in Quimper, and took pictures of the whole Jacob family. It was very loving. And just before the war, just before the 1940 war, Picasso again drove down in his limousine, and with Dora Maar was his companion at that time, and surprised Jacob in his little rented room in Saint-Benoît village, and invited Jacob to come live with him in Paris, invited him again. And Jacob said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. But it's important. The reason I'm stressing this is that so many people have only remembered what looks like a betrayal and is a kind of betrayal. When Jacob was arrested by the Gestapo, his friend, the musician Henri Sauguet, and I spoke to Sauguet about this. I've heard the story at firsthand from Sauguet's lips. He and Pierre Coll, who was Jacob's young dealer, went to Picasso, and they said, would you sign a petition to the Germans to release Jacob from Drancy? And Picasso did say, Max is an angel. He can fly over the wall by himself. So that's a horrible, cruel, cynical thing to say. And it was repeated all over the place. But it is also the case, and I'm not trying to make it better, but it is the case that Picasso was in a vulnerable position as a resident alien and could be deported to Franco's fascist Spain. And then Picasso went behind the scenes to Georges Prade, the collaborationist who was kind of working with the Germans and who was trying to get Jacob out, sort of trying. And Picasso said to Prade, okay, I'll sign. What can I do to get Max out? And Prade said, don't bother. The Gestapo has no interest. They're not going to pay any attention and will just put you in danger. So he didn't. But anyway, it's important to get the record straight because it was misrepresented by Jacob's first biographer, Pierre Andreu, who also claimed that Picasso never went to the funeral mass for Jacob, and Picasso was certainly there. All the other witnesses saw him.
I'm so glad that you gave that story the depth that it requires in the book. So now the great prose poem, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Good. This is one of Jacob's last poems when he couldn't, as a Jew, he couldn't publish under Vichy. So his last work was only circulated among friends or a few published anonymously in resistance journals. But this poem became famous after the war. By the way, Jacob is a Jew, but was wearing the yellow star. Who has seen the toad crossing the road? It's a tiny man. He drags along on his knees as if he were ashamed. No, it's just rheumatism. One leg trails behind. He brings it forward. That's how he advances. Pygmy clown. Has he crawled from the sewer? Is he going there? No one has noticed the toad in the street. Before, no one noticed me in the street. Now, children are amazed by my yellow star. Happy toad, you don't have a yellow star.
Just does me in every time.
Yeah.
Does me in.
Me too.
So on to questions from the audience. Robert in the audience is currently reading a biography of Cocteau, Jean Cocteau, and Max Jacob plays a large role in the book. And Robert is wondering if you, Rosanna, could further discuss their relationship.
That's a very important, it's a really important relationship. There's a huge correspondence, which has been beautifully edited by Anne Kimball, published in French, of the Jacob Cocteau correspondence, both of them brilliant letter writers. And they became friends after World War I, or just at the end of World War I, when Cocteau was styling himself the frivolous prince, le prince frivole, but becoming interested in becoming part of the avant-garde, and so courted Picasso and Satie and the ballet russe and so forth. So he and Jacob became very good friends, and it's an interesting friendship because they were not lovers, but they were both gay men, and they understood each other, and they didn't have to lie and prevaricate and put on masks. And so their correspondence is deeply affectionate and deeply witty. And they tracked each other's work very closely. So it's a terrific source, these letters between Cocteau and Jacob. And Cocteau, because he was, alas, quite close to the Germans occupying Paris, he was really quite in a sense, a collaborator. At least we might call him a cultural collaborator. He hung out with Gerhard Heller and, the ghastly Nazi sculptor Arno Breker. He was in with all those people. And when Jacob was in Drancy, Cocteau was one of the key people trying to get him out and wrote an eloquent letter to the German embassy, which was, of course, not forwarded to the Gestapo, which had control over who was in prison. So I have to say, I don't love Cocteau's poetry. I think it's pretty lame, but I think he's a brilliant filmmaker, and he's a fascinating character. And he's to me, deeply troubling character. He said in his journal, he wrote in his journal about World War II, he said he didn't want he used the word frivolity. He didn't want the silly frivolity of war to interrupt his important work in writing plays.
He's got his priorities straight.
Yeah.
We have another question from Kieran. You mentioned that Jacob threw you off track, steering you away from painting and toward poetry. Have you ever returned to painting? Also, I loved your description of research as a haunting. Could you say more about that? So maybe a little more about your painting and a little more about your haunting. Great question.
Painting for me, I was drawing and painting from about the age of 4, and I seriously studied it with serious artists and had encouragement. I think it would be like training to be a ballet dancer, because painting is also very physical. So when I discovered about age 23 that my energies were going more into writing than into painting, and of course by that time I had to earn a living too, which interrupts art. It was a grief for me. It was like a love affair. You couldn't quite let go, but it was going. And it's not something I could do casually, because I had given so much passionate discipline and devotion for years. But what I've kept is a way of looking. That visual alertness is key to my sense of life. And I do draw still as a way of training my eye and keeping my hand a little bit in, but it's very unpretentious drawing, and it's totally private. And as for the haunting, I don't think I can say more about it, except that that's what it feels like to me. And when I love archives, I have come to adore archives through all these years of working with Jacob, of looking at the actual paper, the handwriting, the mess, the stains on the paper. And I feel spirits rising out of those letters.
So Micah has a question for you. Much of Jacob's work remains untranslated into English. So what do you think is the greatest difficulty in translating his work into English?
Oh, good question. One is puns. It's puns and wordplay, and what I mentioned before, the phonetics, because the sound patterning is so crucial, and also the polyvalent meanings all crammed into single words. That's really hard to get. Somebody who's doing a terrific job with that is Alexander Dickau, who is now has translated, and it's coming out, one of Jacob's great poetry collections, Le Laboratoire Central, the Central Laboratory. And Alex Dickau is perfectly bilingual, French and English, and he gets a lot of the puns and a lot of the sound play into English. It's quite ingenious. It's very hard. I wish someone would translate more of Jacob's experimental fiction. He invented, we haven't had time to talk about that, and isn't so much the focus of my book, though I do discuss it. He invented a whole new kinds of ways to write short stories. Some of them are monologues, some of them are letters, and Saul Bellow loved them. I talked a lot with Bellow about these. Bellow thought they were fabulous. They are fabulous, and they should be more translated.
Seems like the right time. It sounds like
Yeah.
they're just right for our current genre blurring moment.
Yeah, right.
Hallucinatory moment. Yeah, how cool. So Bob asks, I know you lived with Jacob for years, but when did you start writing the text itself? I guess the biography itself.
Oh, that's hard to answer. I had a blessed Guggenheim grant in 1985, and I dragged a 6-month-old baby and a 2-year-old to France. It was insane. I cannot believe I did that, and lived in a dark hole near the Bibliothèque Nationale, the old Bibliothèque Nationale in the Rue de Richelieu, which is so beautiful. I can't bear the new one. And a dear self-sacrificial babysitter who had the kids 4 hours a day so I could run to the library or do my interviews. So several years were spent collecting information and learning how little I knew, learning how ignorant I was, and tracking things down. And then I started writing the first chapter and would get interrupted by having to teach full time and take care of kids and my parents and et cetera, illness in the family and other books. But I kept going back and going back. So I wrote the first chapters in the 1980s, the later 1980s, early 1990s. And I kept learning more and having to go back and revise. So it was a process of accretion of many years. And the last, I'd say 5 years, I rewrote the whole book. And my poor beloved editor at Norton, Jill Bielaski, and her assistant, Drew Whiteman, watched me. I gave them, poor things, 400,000 words. And they just shook their heads. They said, we can't publish 400,000 words. So I spent the next year and a half or something cutting 400,000 words down to almost for 200,000 words.
Wow. Wow.
If that helps. I gave you a very shop talk answer.
So we have just time for a final question, Rosanna. You've been very generous with these questions. So Stefan asked, like Stefan, I was also struck by you're talking about Frank O'Hara being a similar poet to Jacob. Are there any contemporary or recent poets that also remind you of Jacob or write in a similar register? And what are you both reading and working on now? I guess that's just going to be for you. What are you
Yeah.
What are you reading and working on now?
Similar poets right now. Gosh. Maybe I'm so immersed in Jacob right now that I can't off the top of my head name a contemporary English language poet I think is working in that mode. And I think it's just that right now I'm probably having a little dementia that I can't.
Well, I thought the O'Hara was a brilliant.
I think, well, O'Hara was reading Reverdy and,
Exactly.
and Jacob and John Ashbery. Let me say, John Ashbery, who's no longer alive, but Ashbery translated some of the Cornéadé, the dice cup. Ashbery was very influenced by Jacob. And if I have time, I'll tell you a little anecdote that was one of my excitements. I was talking with John Ashbery a few years ago about Jacob and the work I was doing. He said, "Oh, maybe you can help me. I have a letter by Jacob, but I don't know who it's to." And so this is amazing. I went to his apartment. He took out, someone years ago gave John Ashbery a first edition of the Cornéadé, the 1917 dice cup. Inside, it was bought on the bookcase along the Seine. Inside of it was a handwritten letter by Jacob addressed to chers messieurs, gentlemen, plural. And Ashbery said, who are these people? And I knew immediately It was a letter that Jacob was writing to his own publishers, the Émile Paul brothers, plural, asking them to help Reverdy, who needed financial support. And so I was so thrilled, and Ashbury, frankly, was thrilled that I had identified what this letter was about. And it would turn out to be important in my book because Reverdy and Jacob were very close, but also they were enemies in a sense. They were fighting over the priority about the prose poem. So this letter was a wonderful document of generosity.
Huh. What a wonderful little tie it up with a bow for the evening. That was perfect, Rosanna. Thank you. Thank you so much. The perfect anecdote.
Thank you, Chris, so much. And thank you to 192 Books and the Paula Cooper Gallery. And to all of you who care about Max Jacob, or at least I hope you care about him. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Christopher Benfey and Rosanna Warren. That was just incredible. It was so wonderful to listen to that and just be immersed in sort of this culture and this time, and just to really think about it. And wow, just wonderful. If you'd like to get the book, come by the store. We're open every day for browsing, 11 to 5. I've already had some people emailing me to reserve their copies. So if you want to get a copy of the Max Jacob book, just send us an email or give us a call and we'll set one aside for you when they come back. You can also order them from our bookshop.org page. There's a link below if you just want them sent straight to you, or you live out of town, something like that. We also have copies of Christopher's wonderful books in store, so come by and grab them. That's 11 to 5, socially distanced browsing. Everything is spick and span here, so please come on by. Next week, October 30th at 6:15, we're going to have an event with Pamela Lee and David Joslet on their new books from MIT Press, so that should be a real treat, so tune in for that. If you like this event and you think you know someone who would like it, you can send the recording to them. These recordings go up right after, and we've got recordings of all our past events, so yeah, take a look. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Christopher. That was a great